This is the Regenerative Real Estate Podcast. Revitalizing the world together. Hi, everybody. Welcome back. This is your host, Neil Collins, the Regenerative Real Estate Podcast. I am very pleased to be joined today with someone that is a prolific thought leader in the real estate space and urban planning. His name is Dr. Michael Mehaffy. Excuse me. We just went over this. He is an urbanist, an architectural theorist, an urban philosopher. He's a researcher, educator, and is the executive director of the Sustasis Foundation based out of Portland. He's also the senior research associate at the KTH Royal Institute of Technology and the director of the Future of Places Research Network in Stockholm, Sweden. Michael, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on this podcast.
My pleasure, Neil. Glad to be with you.
Michael, whenever I look at the internet and I try to do research on our guests before they come on the show, yours is overwhelmingly dominated by articles and books and blog posts. And it was such a pleasure to be able to do research on your background, because it was really speaking to a philosophy that I think a lot of us in real estate are driving towards. But it's quite an impressive bio that you have. And I read that you grew up in Beaumont, Texas, or at least were born there. But I'd love to get a brief history of where you came from.
Sure. Well, so I moved to Austin as quickly as I could. Not that Beaumont is a bad place, but Austin is a more interesting place and a place that fit me better. As you know, in my education, in high school, actually, I moved there, and then I did go to University of Texas for a while in philosophy. But actually, where I started was to sort of go back to my story, my journey, if you will. I started in music, and I was doing music composition and 20th century music, as it's sometimes referred to. And got a admission to California Institute of the Arts, which is a very interesting place, was a very interesting place at that time. And they had not only interdisciplinary arts education, but also liberal arts. And so I was studying sociology and psychology and philosophy, and really got turned on by all those subjects. And at the same time, I became very, very alarmed by what I was seeing happening around the school. You know, the rapid sprawling urbanization that was happening in that area. This was in the early 1970s. And I began to really think this was a much more serious issue that we needed to confront in some way. And that much as I love music, and I still love music, I have my piano right around the corner here that I noodle around on. I didn't feel that was what was needed, you know, what I could do in my life. I felt that this problem of development that seemed to be destroying the world, and I could see it. I could see this beautiful valley just being filled up with really low quality urbanization and sprawling and car dominated and pollution and everything else. And so I didn't immediately go into urban planning and architecture. But I remember that was a really formative moment for me. And then what I did is I had a friend at the time who said, you know, you really should just maybe go to college. You know, you should take a step back. You jumped into this, you know, field of music, which is a very tough field to make a living in. Maybe you need to not go so fast into this one direction. And he was absolutely right. And so I did. I studied liberal arts and philosophy and psychology, anthropology, and other fields. And then gradually, at some point, I discovered architecture and discovered this guy, Christopher Alexander, who some of you may know, just at that time had released a book called A Pattern Language, which, by the way, I happen to have a copy of it here, propping up my microphone. But It was a very important moment for me because what he spoke to was this profound disorder that was happening in the built environment and the possibility of a recovery of another kind of order, a more ecological order in both the natural sense and in the human sense. You know, the idea that we could have a human ecology in the places that we live that was regenerative, as you know, I love the title of your enterprise. So that became my direction in my career. And so long story short, I went to UC Berkeley. I studied with Chris Alexander. I then started doing my own design build work. I gradually got into urban design and urban planning because that was really what I thought was most dysfunctional in many ways. As important as individual homes are, it doesn't matter if they're not interconnected with good public space and walkability and all the other characteristics. Community, scales of community, as Ross likes to say. And so I eventually, after practicing for a number of years and getting more into the urban scales, I went back and got my PhD in architecture in the field of climate change and urban design and the impact of urban patterns on different levels of greenhouse gas emissions, and to a lesser extent on the need for adaptation, because you know, adaptation and mitigation are really two sides of the same coin when it comes to climate change. So, so I'm really interested in the character of architecture, the character of place, the character of community, and the kind of urbanization that we're creating today that's dysfunctional, and then why that's dysfunctional. And that opened up another whole set of interesting topics for me about, you know, the economics and the things that I know you've struggled with in your career, and we've all struggled with. What is this sort of operating system that we're dealing with nowadays? This, what Chris Alexander calls System B, that is destroying our world. And I think we're seeing that now with the pandemic, that a lot of things are being brought into high relief right now about what we've done wrong over the last 50 years or 100 years, and the reforms that we need to make. And then the other thing I just want to mention before I finish up this long-winded introduction is that I also got, I had a interest all along in computers and in computer science. I took programming in high school and back in the old days when you did everything on the mainframes. And then I went out and bought my first Apple II Plus in like 1979. And so I've always had that interest. And so when I learned about the work that Ward Cunningham and the people who had taken Chris Alexander's work and applied it to software and to Wiki, Ward has invented Wiki based on pattern languages and other things, I was very excited by that. I got to know Ward and been collaborating with him on a number of things. We've written papers together and worked together on a new edition of actually this book, which is a new pattern language based on patterns that are part of something called the New Urban Agenda, which is essentially a lot of these transformative ideas that have been adopted and are beginning to be more widespread. And there's a wiki version of this that maybe, I don't know if we can send links around to people, but it's just npl.wiki. npl.wiki. You just type that in and you'll go right to the wiki that Ward took the lead in helping in creating as part of this collaboration. So that's a huge part of my work these days, and something I really love and I'm really excited about. So sorry for the long-winded introduction, but that's
this is exactly what I'm looking for, because
right.
I will share that link on our show notes. But I think the really interesting thing for me is that you grew up in an era where suburbanization had already started going, and your professional career got launched at a time whenever fossil fuels were quite cheap. The suburbs were still picking up steam, but you also saw a transition into the rise of the renaissance of urbanism after 100 years.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm very curious about is what was it like to see suburbanization spreading, and were you just a voice in an echo chamber at that time?
Well, you have to remember in the 1960s when I was in high school, basically, junior high and then high school, we began to be aware of all of these issues of environmental destruction, and pollution was horrendous compared to the way it is today. Although, it's not great today, but it was quite terrible then. You have the proverbial rivers on fire and incredible smog in LA, which I witnessed when I was there, and so on. And I remember my mother actually started a recycling center, and I was a volunteer I think that was 1968, 69, something like that. And then of course, Earth Day happened in 1970. So there was a growing awareness that we have some big challenges to confront here. I think my experience was actually on the ground when I was there at Cal Arts and looking out and seeing this happening. And maybe I had a perspective that was not that many people had at that time about urban development being a key dimension of this, and the amount of driving that people were doing, that sort of driving and drive-through lifestyle, the consumption patterns, the meat eating, and all the other things that were really contributing to depletion of resources, including oil. I remember the 1973 Arab oil embargo, and that was a wake-up call, like, hey, this stuff is not infinite, and it's not without impacts in our lives. And so I think I remember also taking a flight when I was going out to Cal Arts and coming in for a landing, and just seeing the sprawl and seeing the devastation really of junkyards and pollution and the other things that you really could see. I'm sort of a amateur urban morphologist in that I look urban morphology lover in that I look out at landscapes whenever I'm in an airplane. And it's fascinating what you can see, what you can observe. And another person that was a big luminary for me was has been Jane Jacobs. And she has always said throughout her career, you just need to observe, you need to get down on the ground and really, see what's happening. And I think that's what I did. And that had a big effect on me. And coincidentally, I began also doing design work because for me, it was kind of a compositional outlet. They say that architecture is frozen music, and I think there's some truth to that. That it's ultimately composition and rhythms and patterns and harmonies and all those kinds of things. But it's also not just art. That's another point that I've learned from Jacobs and others, that if we treat buildings as just sort of giant sculptures, we're getting the order wrong. As my friend Paul Moraine likes to say, life comes first and then the art. Let's get those in support of one another and in the right relationship, because if we let the art become the sort of primary focus, it can become very, very toxic. We can become mere marketers for big corporations and big industrial forces that are quite toxic, no matter how sort of self-styled progressive we are in claiming that, oh, well, look at all the progressive things we're doing. We can become co-opted so easily, and I've seen that over and over again in my interactions with architecture schools and architecture professionals. And I think it's something we have to take very seriously as professionals. I'm not just saying this as an outsider, because I've taught in architecture schools. I've had appointments now in 7 schools in 6 countries, and visited and lectured in many more. So I've seen I've seen the world of not only architecture, but construction. I've been in that world, and real estate development. I've been in that world. I've sort of seen different pieces of this operating system, as I refer to it. And I've seen how people can get co-opted, and they can get their best intentions can get corrupted. And we can make bad decisions as a civilization, even though locally in our own little corner, we think we're making a good decision, or at least a good decision for our own self-interest locally. But it's not a good decision long-term. It's not we're creating impacts. We're creating externalities, as the economists like to say. And so we've got to rewire that system of relationships and that operating system in some transformative way. And I think that's something that a lot of people are thinking about and talking about, writing about. And I think it's something that we've got to accelerate these days.
I'm glad to hear you say that people are thinking about it and talking about it. Do you think that that's actually showing up in a day-to-day physical change of our communities?
I think, yes, there are people that are making reforms. And, for example, changing the codes and if you think about, why we have the kind of development that we have right now. Like I refer to this idea of an operating system for growth. And that ultimately consists of the laws, real estate laws, the codes, the standards, the zoning codes, the building codes, the regulations, also the models that people use, the marketing models and the models of planning and types of plans. For example, the sort of spaghetti sprawl pattern that was popular in the 1950s and 60s for street designs, and so on and so forth. And also the financial incentives and disincentives. There are big financial incentives to take advantage of economies of scale and standardization. But that leaves out the other very important economies of place and of differentiation, which is very important ecologically and very important for a kind of ecology of economics too, ecology of an economy, as Jane Jacobs also has written about. So I think there are people who are, for example, reforming the zoning codes. You mentioned the new urbanists. There's a lot of reform work going on there. People who are reforming engineering codes, the super wide streets that you can land a 747 on. Instead of that, we have context sensitive design, which is about bringing in multimodal transportation, not just vehicles and not just the car, but also pedestrians, also bicycles, and making room for them and maybe narrowing down a little bit for the car to get it to go a little more slowly. And then also having the streets very nicely interconnected so that you still have good mobility. You don't have huge traffic jams that, create gridlock. But that's because there's lots of permeability and people can move around through the city in many different pathways rather than big choke points, which is what we did wrong, frankly, in a lot of our suburban street patterns of the 60s and 70s. So those things are all beginning to change. And then also I mentioned earlier when I was talking about this book, the new pattern language book that we produced that Ward Cunningham has helped to collaborate on, and quite a few others. And it is based on a document that's called the New Urban Agenda that I briefly mentioned. And I've been involved, we worked at KTH University in Stockholm on developing some of the language that went into the New Urban Agenda. And I don't want to take the whole conversation talking about that document, but just briefly, it's really reflecting the ideas of people like Jacobs and Alexander and the new urbanists, saying it's not all about the car, it's more about walkability, about mix of modes and transportation, about mix of uses, not just single use, segregated zoning. It's all about creating more diversity and more equity in the city, more interconnectivity for all the people to enjoy the benefits of the city. And all of these kinds of things that I think many of us recognize have to be reformed from the the 1950s era and onward of sprawl and automobile dominance and functionally segregated zoning and along with other kinds of segregation that fit right into that pattern, right? And so I think all of those reforms are underway. And that's really great news. The new urban agenda has actually been adopted by acclamation by all 193 countries that are member states of the United Nations. So that's a great landmark, I think, and it's really something I'm incredibly gratified and hopeful that that's happened. But it's a long way from everybody saying, yes, we need to change, to actually changing it. It's a little like, the alcoholic admitting that they're an alcoholic, but it's a long way from that point to actually recovery, right? And so we have a lot more work to do. And that's where I think there's a lot of work for, I'm sure, everybody listening and everybody who is interested in the ecology of our environment and the impact that we humans are having. I mean, at the end of the day, the challenges that we're facing, not only environmentally, but also culturally and economically, have to do with the way we settle and interact and use resources and consume resources, deplete resources. And so I think we all have to really get on this great transition that has to happen in the years ahead.
And I've heard you talk about how we're all transformers and we're all designers, and we're literally doing that as we live and work and play and recreate.
Yeah.
The challenge that I see is that with suburbs, they were created with those structural barriers in place, and even from the non-grid pattern of the roads to the CC&Rs that are very restrictive. How can we have that transformational experience that's truly bottom up, or do you see it being more of a top-down approach to revitalize, or I don't want to call it revitalize these areas, but have a more urbanist feel to the community so that we can have a ecological approach?
Yeah, retrofitting, as a lot of people refer to it.
Right.
I think there are two components to it. One is we have to just change our mental models and the ways that we think about these challenges, and that's beginning to happen. That was Jane Jacobs' point in Death and Life, the last chapter of Death and Life of Great American Cities. That's what she talked about, is changing our mental models about how we go about thinking about a problem like a city or a suburb. And so yeah, it's a bottom-up process that has some top-down aspects. It's not one or the other, right? But it's a lot more bottom-up than it has been, because part of the failure of our technocratic system, System B, as Alexander referred to it, is that it has been a culture of specialists and of command and control approaches that don't work in the end. They as we know from systems theory and from understanding how these complex adaptive systems actually work, you need distributed agents, and you need self-organization, and you need all these other kinds of phenomena that we now know a lot more about now than we did then. And Jacob's last chapter is fantastic on this, by the way. I highly recommend anybody to read it or reread it. So it's a combination of those, and it's starting with the mental models. But then we have the huge challenge of retrofitting these places. And that's a process of sort of putting the toothpaste back into the tube, so to speak. It's on some level, it's going to be very, very hard to do that. And it's probably going to be a combination of infilling of some sites that are much better quality and gradually transforming other sites into better quality, and triage, and sort of dealing with some areas that are not going to be so good. But it's also not only changing the places themselves, like adding street connections and pedestrian pathways and bicycle pathways and all that sort of thing. And those things are happening in many, many places in suburban America and suburban places around the world. But it's also, again, changing the systems that generate those kinds of structures, and that financially reward certain kinds of structures and not others. And, we need to find new financial mechanisms, new, for example, taxation mechanisms and land value tax and mechanisms that tax resource depletion and reward ingenuity with fewer resources. Some of your viewers are probably going to know about Henry George and the idea of Georgist tax policy. So that's one example of all the kinds of changes in not only the physical form, but also the system that generates and regenerates and perpetuates the physical form of the suburbs. So lots and lots of, that's just part of the reason that I get drawn into all these different fields, because you sort of grab onto a thread and it takes you in another direction, and you have to tease that out if you're going to get anywhere. So, but it's fascinating as well.
What does that look like to the lay person, right? The shop owner or the suburban mom that is bringing her kids to school. What do you see that people are going out to the suburbs and they're bringing an urban mentality to it, or are they going out there for a reason because they want more space and they want a car-based life?
Well, first of all, I love what you said earlier about, people are all participants in, this sort of bottom-up process, which is the reverse of this sort of over-specialized technocratic culture that we've had that's made quite a mess of things. And I love what Herbert Simon, another great figure, polymath, said, that everyone is a designer, essentially. Everyone designs who seeks to take existing conditions and to change them into preferred ones. And I love that definition because, for one thing, it raises a lot of questions about, well, wait a minute, who exactly is doing the preferring, and how do they know what they prefer? And then how do they achieve that? How do they, what happens if the preference changes along the way, and so on and so forth. So everyone is a designer. The mom who comes out to the suburbs, all the people that you mentioned are co-designers in a sense. They're all the distributed agents that help to co-create the city. When they make purchasing decisions, that's a design feedback that says, whoever designed that thing, make more of them, design like that more, and so on. And so I think if we think about it that way, then we realize that we're always balancing lots and lots of different factors, and we're always dealing with what Herbert Simon also called bounded rationality. If you're a mom, like my two daughters, for example, who are coping with a lot of factors when they're thinking about where to buy or where to rent, it's not just, is the house beautiful? It's also, is it close to the school? Is it affordable? Does it have enough bedrooms? So there are all these other factors that I think we in the planning and designing profession have to take all of those things seriously. And at the same time, we have to take, is it beautiful seriously? Because sometimes people don't pay as much attention to that in the short term. And those are values that in the long term become much more important. Those are the externality values, again, that I was talking about before, that, creating a neighborhood that's actually regenerative and that people care about, and that they'll build over time, and it'll become better and better and better, and more efficient and more. This is the way biological processes work, and it's the way human ecologies work at their best. So that's a long-winded way of answering your question, but I think we have to understand there's lots of different factors that people are balancing, and people are easily overwhelmed by the decisions that they're making, and easily, it goes back to the corruption thing I was talking about before, easily manipulated, frankly, into making decisions that are not the best for them or for the community, but they're the best for somebody else who's doing the manipulation, because that's what's happening in a kind of multiplayer game, a massive multiplayer game, which is what an economy ultimately is. And, we don't have to be conspiracy theorists to recognize that that's what happens all the time in an economy. There are people who are very good at gaming the system and distorting the outcome to create something that is really good for them in the short term, especially financially, and really not good for the community as a whole. And you can't just regulate that problem. You can't just say, oh, well, we'll just pass a law that says you can't build houses like this, because again, that's a command and control approach, and that doesn't work. You need an ecological approach. You need places that have their own inherent resilience and their own regenerative capacity. And there are ways to do that that are very, comprehensible. And it's a lot like medical analogy. I find myself, especially now, referring back to the medical analogy of a practitioner who is using the science to make the best possible decision about a very complex phenomenon, a holistic phenomenon that's going on when you're talking about a patient's health, a human being, and their health, their complex systems of their body. And yeah, you use the evidence that you can, but you don't use it in a narrow sense. You don't, take a child with a fever and just throw them in the ice bath because the numbers say it has there's a fever, throw them in the ice. You use a much more sort of contextual, holistic approach, but you use the evidence that you have available, and you try to make the long-term decisions, and you try to iterate those and, evaluate over time and become more effective over time. And then you share your results with other people. And this is how medicine as a whole, learns and grows and becomes more effective in dealing with something like the coronavirus pandemic, or and in the same way, it's the way that I think we in the urban development professions are going to become more effective over time in dealing with our challenges of unhealthy communities, unhealthy in a lot of literal and figurative senses of the word. And I think we have to really think about how that is going to transform our professions, and how we can resist the, if you will, the quackery and the snake oil salesmen and women who are in many ways running the show economically when it comes to the real estate development and what gets built and why. Not necessarily because they're they have evil intent, but they're just looking at their own self-interest very locally and in a very sort of isolated way, and they're not like the scientist or the medical practitioner who's reading the journals and trying to understand the best possible outcomes long term. And so we have to transform our professions, and I include real estate as a profession, absolutely, development as a profession, that also has to change.
And what I really like about that in the system and the patterns that your career has really hit upon is that we do need to have healthy relationships and healthy communities, and it can go down and up, and it goes down to how do we create health and wellness within our built environment of the materials that we're using, up to how are we getting around? I think I've listened to you talk about a development that you did out in Beaverton, Orinco Station, and the data that was coming back on the amount of people that were walking to the grocery store for the first time.
Yeah. Actually, that was in Hillsborough, and that was part of the Portland region's 2040 plan, as it's called, which is the idea that we need to get the suburbs integrated into the multimodal transportation, and not just everybody driving everywhere all the time. And because they had created the Intel campuses and the other high-tech campuses in Hillsborough, and that was a great sort of economic boon, but it was very dysfunctional from a planning point of view, because it was huge job centers without any housing and without any mixed use. It was just another example of this sort of technocratic, segregated, huge campuses out in the middle of nowhere, everybody drives everywhere kind of thing. So the region, Metro, had created a plan that said there needs to be a town center here. And it just so happens that the guy who owned that site, or the company that owned that site, the guy who was the president, was my client. I was doing a house for him at the time. And I ended up going to work for him as the project manager. But what it was all about was creating more housing to match the jobs, and also more different ways to get around, not just driving, of course, and also not driving long distances, maybe driving shorter distances. That's a part of the mix too. And so the research that you were talking about, it's available online. If you Google Podobnik, P-O-D-O-B-N-I-K, Orenco, O-R-E-N-C-O, you'll probably find it, or we can send the links out. And he looked at the community in 2002 and looked for signs, indicators of social capital, which is social interaction between people and trust, essentially, the willingness to borrow a cup of sugar kind of thing, or participate in group activities. And he found that that was very high. And then he also looked at transportation behavior, and he found that walking was very high, and that driving was still relatively high for commuting, but it was also the same as what was happening in central Portland. So that was actually much better than the surrounding suburban environment. And, you know, changing our car-based habits is very much a work in progress. We're not going to get to the level of, say, you know, Copenhagen or Stockholm or Amsterdam anytime soon, but we're moving in that direction, and that's the important thing. And so when they looked at walking behaviors again in 2007, 5 years later, I think it was, they found a huge jump in the walking. Originally, it had been, I think the number of people who walked to shopping 5 or more times a week was 19%. And that's a pretty impressive number. But by 2007, it was 50%.
Wow.
And part of that was because we actually had built a grocery store in the town center, which was very important, you know, to have all those different uses there that people could walk to. But I think part of it also, and we certainly saw this anecdotally, is that people began to get out of their cars and sell the second car, and you know, tell us that they're driving a lot less, and and that's been confirmed by some other research that's been done. The requirements for parking in that area, a study by Reed Ewing and his colleagues showed that the parking demand was way below even the minimum that the city had required for that area. And so lots of anecdotal evidence that the change in behavior is very real there. Yeah, it's a long way from, again, you know, European cities, but it's moving in that direction. And it shows that a lot can be done in the American suburbs to transform our patterns of connectivity and movement and resource consumption.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I also remember seeing that immigrants had a high ownership of the small businesses in that area.
That's true, yeah. Although to be fair, Intel itself has a high percentage of immigrants because they recruit from around the world, of course, and there are a lot of Asian employees at Intel and so on and so forth. But yeah, absolutely, there were immigrants, and the other thing that we were very proud of, really, initially, was that the price affordability. We started out with units selling for $79,000, which you can't find anything like that nowadays, unfortunately, and going up to $479,000, I think, was the most expensive. And we had one couple put 2 units together, 2 brownstone row houses, live work row houses, and invest enough money that it ended up being like $1 million property. So $79,000 to $1 million, rental units for $500 a month, up to, you know, 2,000 or whatever. So lots of income diversity as well, economic diversity. And then later on, I facilitated the development of 3 affordable housing projects in there. Once the prices got higher, because there was a high demand for that kind of community, and there was location efficiency, so it was cheaper to live there, but the prices were going up. So we got a senior affordable community and 2 workforce affordable housing developments there as well. So yeah, it's a really interesting kind of a laboratory, I think, of how you can do suburban infill and were some things that we didn't get right, and that lessons learned that I think people can learn from as well, but also some very encouraging outcomes, I think.
Michael, we're going through a really interesting time where we're 2 months into a lockdown due to the pandemic. I've got clients in New York City. They're going cabin fever right now.
Right.
They're crazy. I know that there's a bit of the psychology of saying that people in those very dense urban centers, they're going to be looking towards more suburban areas.
Right.
What's your prognosis on where we're going here?
I worry that this pandemic could fuel our worst instincts, being car dominated, sealed up in our capsules of our cars and our homes and so on. And, declining public spaces, declining compact walkable places. That doesn't need to happen because the research is very clear. It's not density in the abstract, because there is no such thing as density in the abstract. What there is different patterns of people coming together in different ways at different times. There's lots of different sorts of forms of that. So I wrote a blog post recently, I'll put that up, and I took one of Chris Alexander's great papers called A City is Not a Tree, where he essentially said you can't segregate all the functions of the city into these neat compartments. And the blog post I wrote was called A Building is Not a Tree. And the point was that you can't think of a building as only one, major tree trunk. Because what you do when you do that is you concentrate everybody into one place, and then they do tend to transmit pathogens more readily, not only the coronavirus, but also Legionnaire's disease and other things. I was part of a symposium a couple of months ago where an epidemiologist was talking about this and talking about cruise ships and why the incidence of transmission is so high. It's because people are forced into these common areas, these stairwells and elevators and common dining facilities and so on. And the same thing happens in some kinds of buildings, but not in other kinds of buildings at the exact same density. So I think the point is that we can have compact, dense, walkable, thriving public spaces that are not high risk when it comes to transmitting pathogens, that we can practice sociable distancing, as I've called it, and still have great thriving neighborhoods and cities. At the same time, we shouldn't go to the other extreme and say, oh, well, then that's great. We'll all just jam in together into these giant, urban cores. We need to think polycentrically. We need to think about lots of scales of activity and scales of people being urban or suburban or rural, but still having the walkable, compact, the benefits of urbanization, the benefits of cities and towns and neighborhoods that we can all get at many different scales. And so I think we have to think in many different scales and stop this sort of one scale or one high density way of thinking. And we also have to stop thinking in terms of one scale of time, whether it's the economic return, the 5-year plan or the 4-year election cycle, and start thinking of not only the short term, what we're going to earn today or this year, but how we're going to grow as an economy in 5, 10, 20, 100, 1,000 years. We need to think in many scales of time and space. And I think that's one of the big lessons of the transition that we have ahead.
I want to go here because you just brought up a 1,000-year timeline. Are you hopeful, like as a species and a civilization, where do you lie on the spectrum of hope versus despair?
I don't think, well, first of all, I think if there's anything that history has taught us, it's that it's surprising, that it's nonlinear and we can't predict. And that isn't necessarily good news or bad news. If we think that the world is going to come to an end and climate change is going to kill us all, it might be that doesn't happen at all. But it might be that it happens twice as fast, so that isn't necessarily good news. But what it does tell us, I think, is that we have to be more humble in our judgments of these things. And in that, I think there's room for optimism. And also, I think there's room for optimism in understanding how systems in the natural world can be incredibly resilient, and systems in the human world can be incredibly resilient. They can surprise us in lots of ways. We can see things happening that we really didn't imagine would happen. And I think we're seeing those with the coronavirus pandemic, and the fact that we're able to adapt and we're able to respond and find new ways of carrying on community and carrying on conversations like this one, and not just being isolated and in despair. So I think there's a lot of room for optimism if you look at the systems that we're dealing with in that way, and systems that have the capacity for resilience and regeneration, and work on that. At the same time, we can't be, Pollyanna about the challenges that we face, especially these sort of distortions of the system that we're dealing with, the kind of cognitive illusions and delusions. Frankly, I want to tell one quick story, which is that a story some of your viewers may know about how bees form new colonies. This was described by Neil deGrasse Tyson in the new Cosmos. And so they go off when the new queen is formed, and a certain number of bees will go with her, and they'll locate on a tree branch somewhere. And then scouts will go off looking for the place to relocate. And they'll have to find a place that has just the right dimensions and the right location up from the ground, away from the bears, and so on and so forth. And then they come back and they do their little waggle dance where they say, here's where this place is and why it's such a great place. And then they vibrate with intensity to show how good they think this place is. And then some other bees will come around them and they'll get excited. And then some of them will go off and check and verify. And so the bees will come back, and then gradually what will happen is that some of those sites that are actually the best sites, the bees will be the most excited about, and more bees and more bees. And finally, the one site that's the absolute best site of any that they found emerges from this actually democratic process. It's quite inspiring in a way. But not only is it democratic, it's intelligent. It's the most intelligent possible decision-making process that those bees have made. So the question I want to ask us all to think about is, why are we dumber than bees? What is it about our systems today that is distorting that process? Like we're getting these distortion bees coming in, these huckster bees who are coming in and saying, nah, don't go to that one, go to this other one, it's better. Here's why, Well, they're getting rewarded for that. They're stealing the honey or something, So if you think about it that way, if you think about from a systems point of view, what can we learn by understanding how natural systems work, including natural systems of intelligence and natural systems of problem solving and of adapting and responding and thriving in the end? Then I think we have a bright future, to answer your question.
Oh, I love that. I love it, especially apropos to, we've had 2 swarms come through our yard in the last.
Wow. They're wonderful. Yeah, I love it.
They are wonderful. Yeah. Michael, let me conclude with this. What's the next book that we can expect to see from you?
So I'm working on several right now. I'm not sure which one is going to be the next one. One that I have in the sort of the works that might take a little longer is one about what I call place networks. It's about a little hard to explain briefly, but how spaces that we occupy have a room-like quality to them. And we form them all the time, even informally as well as formally. Formally, we build walls and doors and so on, but then we create all these abilities to mutate those structures. Like we make the door that's operable, we make the window with the blinds, and then out in the public realm, it continues. We make hedges and gates and fences and markers and plantings and sometimes very informal things. We set out a picnic blanket in a park, and that becomes our little room, And there are rules about who can come onto that, and they're tacit rules, like nobody, if somebody accidentally steps on your picnic blanket, it's no big deal. But if somebody were to come in and squat there, it'd be like, whoa, what are you? So it's about how public space works, and it's really fascinating. And I think it's something that we all need to understand when we're thinking about creating great buildings and great places. You know, it's not about the object, it's about the place.
Well, I look forward to reading that. And what I love is that you're pulling from so many different disciplines, and you can tell that you've got a brain that's, you talked about the medical community and biology and even apiculture and bees. And I've had a great time listening to this. I had an immense pleasure just diving into your work, and I appreciate the work that you're doing, and the world appreciates it as well. So thank you so much for your time, and good luck going forward with your books.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure. And as you can tell, I take immense pleasure from thinking about all this and working on all this. So that's good, because there's a lot of work ahead.
Thanks, Michael.